And welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, South Africa's ruling party members gather to pick a new leader. Would this be a welcome changing of guard or the start of a new political struggle? And China's top managers are in a conference to chart the course of Chinese economic growth. What does high-quality development mean for the future of the country's economy? We begin in South Africa, where thousands of delegates from South Africa's ruling African National Congress, or ANC party, have voted for their new leader. The only two candidates in the tight race are Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, a wealthy businessman, and former Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who is the President Jacob Zuma's ex-wife. Voting started soon after midnight on Sunday and continued into the morning after repeated delays due to disputes over which delegates were qualified to vote, with hundreds of attendees banned from the poll. The result was expected later on Monday, hopefully soon, though it was unclear how long counting would take. Before our discussion about the latest, let's take a look at this.
Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, President Jacob Zuma's ex-wife, is a top contender for the new ANC president post.
She had a fairly decent record as the minister in South Africa. And when she went to the African Union, of course, that the Agenda 2063 comes under her belt is also an achievement, even though she has received mixed reviews for her performance in the African Union.
But if elected, Dlamini-Zuma is likely to bring with her many of the old guard.
Dlamini-Zuma has been running on a platform of radical economic transformation. Under her leadership, what needs to emerge is an economic logic that is counter-hegemonic, which counters the dominant interests in the economy today.
Cyril Ramaphosa is favored by business and investors.
He represents the opposite of the candidate of corruption and state capture. And that candidate of corruption and state capture is Dlamini-Zuma. If Ramaphosa wins, and if my information is correct, investors who have already factored in, by the way, the possibility of a Ramaphosa victory, are queuing to invest in South Africa.
But Ramaphosa's handling of Marikana in 2012, in which 34 miners were gunned down by South African police, will forever haunt him. This conference is being seen as a watershed moment for South Africa. New leadership could change the country's fortunes, but this may still be a long way off.
So what will likely happen next after the changing of guard in South Africa's politics? Let's loop in our panelists that we are joined in our Beijing studio. I hope I get our friend name right. Luyolo Sijage.
Very good, perfect.
There we go.
Thanks for
He
having me.
is coming from Peking University now, as a student and scholar at Yanqing Academy of Scholars and co-founder of PKU Africa think tank. Welcome.
Thank you.
In Shanghai, we are joined by Mr. Zhu Ming, a research fellow at the Center for West Asian and African Studies, China, Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Welcome as well. We're hopefully to be joined later by another guest coming from South Africa. But I want to start with you, Lu Yolo.
That's right.
About what exactly is the nature of this election? Because there has been a lot of zig and zagging during the process, accusations against one another, the unsatisfaction from the public toward ANC, which is the ruling party for 24 years. What exactly is the thing behind this election?
Well, I mean, I think it's really, you're right, it's a watershed moment. So you're coming from the political side, it's a watershed moment for the party. So within the party there's been a realization that the failings that it's had over the past few decades are really causing the kind of disgruntlement that could get them removed from government. From the private sector, there's also, you know, a lack of satisfaction from the kinds of approach and the environment that's been created for them by the government. And then from, even, when you look at the public sector, as the broader society, as you mentioned, there's just broad disgruntlement with the way in which things have gone.
But now here's the question.
Yeah.
Will a change of politician, or rather the top of the party leadership, be able to change the thing? We are now joined by Mr. Zokolo Polase. He is joining us in Johannesburg in South Africa. He's a political analyst who is the managing director of Political Analysis South Africa. Mr. Polase, welcome. A change of person at the top of the party, would that be able to change the situation overall?
Well, in this situation, possibly, because it really matters. They always say elections have consequences, and it's true for this particular election. In that, if Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, one of the candidates, is running for the presidency, it would be much of the same. If Cyril Ramaphosa, on the one hand, were to win, it would represent some sort of, I guess, restoring a sense of stability if, indeed, what he says may be implemented. So elections have consequences, and in this case, changing an individual may help the party.
But Mr. Zhu, as an observer from afar, from China, really a change of person at the top of the party leadership likely to change the whole direction and performance of that ruling party for 24 years? I mean, if you look at these two candidates, one is a former, rather current vice president. He's at the top of the leadership body. Second is the former wife and also former minister of the country's president. So will that really make much difference, Mr. Zhu?
I think that they share some common ground. They all want to change the ANC and change South Africa's economic structure, but I think they have a big difference. For example, Ramaphosa wants to combat corruption and also improve the South Africa's business environment, but Dlamini-Zuma mainly anchor his ex-husband's radical economic transformation and wants to address the economic inequality issues first.
But the question is...
And I think that's to say that the Ramaphosa wants to make a cleaner and a bigger cake. Dlamini-Zuma wants to divide the cake first.
I see. But the question really is, if the African National Congress, the party itself, has won much lower ratings, only a little bit over 50%, right? Will a change of leadership really make that much difference? Because it seems 24 years, they had this chance.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So, and both candidates have realized this. As Mr. Zhu just mentioned, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma has been campaigning on the idea of radical economic transformation, which speaks to, the impoverished masses who have been marginalized and feel marginalized over, the past 24 years. And then Mr. Ramaphosa is coming with the idea that he wants to, sort of cleanse, the kind of culture that has embedded itself in the ANC and renew the organization, and that is appealing to many of the people within the party who have felt marginalized and sidelined over the years.
But, the question is very crucial.
Yeah.
After all, gentlemen, are we talking about the fate of a party, the fate of an economy, or are we talking about, in fact, in this election, the fundamental debate that is taking place in South Africa, which is how much the racial issue is still in the shadow when we talk about politics, when we talk about the economy, when we talk about the societal change. Let me go to you, Mr. Polase. Mr. Polase, can you hear me? All right.
I can hear you.
Wonderful. I'm asking the question, which is how much the issue of race is actually still in the shadow of all the discussions, whether it's politics, economy, the fate of a party which is ruling the country, or the fate of the society.
Well, race remains a critical part of South African society. in that, all of this talk of radical economic transformation could be simply put that it is, I guess, candidates or the party looking to transfer wealth from a majority white population in terms of who possesses that wealth. So it informs every aspect of South African life. Indeed, there is this mantra, at least immediately after the end of apartheid, of the Rainbow Nation and all of that. But you observe closely, you soon realize that was actually superficial. South Africans on a day-to-day basis interact within the cleavages of race. And how you construct politics, how you view the economy, is still viewed from the prism of race. So perhaps at some level, individuals such as Cyril Ramaphosa, who are very critical, for example, in South Africa's own transformation to this democratic order that we have, they may resuscitate the sense of a reconciled nation, a rainbow nation, where aspects of race can still be there, but not be detrimental to the point of what we've come to know as radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital, and all of these things that are quite laden and laced still to this day with race. So race remains a very important aspect of South African political life.
It is remaining a very crucial part, but the question is, Mr. Sigade, really, is it in the right place or in the wrong place? Are we blaming race for all the mistakes that have been made, for the incapability of some officials, or for the still not yet healthy development of the economy? Or are we blaming race for the right things that it should be responsible for?
Well, I mean, I think when we come to the question of race, we can't be, you know, too one-sided about it. We really have to allow for the issue of nuance to come in. On the one side, I mean, race was fundamental in shaping the institutions that, you know, guide how South Africa functions today. So, I mean, it is still very central to the kinds of outcomes that we see today. But then again, the disgruntlement that we see comes from the idea that the leadership that was supposed to change this hasn't done enough to transform. So the fact that we haven't seen the South African economy transforming in a structural way, fundamental transformation, then it can be apportioned in part to the leadership that has followed. But then the reason for race also remaining so central is the fact that it holds a strong sentimental role in the hearts of South Africans. So we can't really look at this from the perspective of economic indicators alone. The role of sentiment and, you know, the kinds of, you know, emotions and humiliation and so on that came with the process of apartheid, and that still remains in terms of the way in which institutions treat people today, is still something that speaks to many people. And that's why I think it's remained so central to the agenda until today.
Very interesting, you just mentioned two words, key words, sentiment and also institution. Whether that has ever changed over the past 2 decades, let's take a look at what ANC has done. The ANC, the African National Congress, which is the party that we are talking about today, trying to seek its top leadership now, has overwhelmingly won every election since 1994. The party has secured 62% of the national vote in 2014 once again. Nearly the same share it won in 1994, but its win slipped to 54% in last year's local election. Its worst since taking power. So here's a debate about whether ANC should change, or actually there has to be a change in the overall political institutional building in South Africa. Mr. Drew, coming from afar as an observer, what do you think?
I think, of course, we know that approval rate of ANC is declining, but I think it is could be described as a temporary phenomenon, because many local polls has suggested that ANC is still popular among the majority of black peoples, and if they say that if they could have a new, fresh leadership, they will still vote for ANC in the future elections. And what's more, even the opposition parties, their approval rate is up, but I think they have faced the challenge of glass ceiling. That still say that they could not win more voters in the near future, because, for example, the Democratic Alliance, in short DA, is the largest opposition party, but it is still not successfully in winning the voters from the black voters. Even it has a new leader who is a black.
Right. We have seen also South Africa included, some of the emerging economies that have been going through some of the difficulties in its national economy. South Africa, with the youth issue, unemployment issue, economic transformation issue, many of those. Mr. Polasse, what is likely to be that strain, you think, for policymakers, whoever is going to be the president of the African National Congress, be able to go with and therefore resolve some of the biggest problems facing the country? Mr. Polasse, your thoughts?
Well, I doubt I would be able to solve it in this interview, but I would, I guess, point at a number of issues. It is true that social expectations are rising. It doesn't mean that people have new expectations, but for example, when South Africa had its period after apartheid, it was easy to deliver basic access, electricity, healthcare, basic healthcare in that sense. So the expectations now are much more solid, they're much more sophisticated in the sense that good governance matters, that there are other aspects of governance just beyond just basic participation. So whomever takes on this baton from President Jacob Zuma needs to acknowledge that and see how this government brings about aspects of good governance. Ultimately, I don't think South Africa has got a lack of vision. We don't need yet another blueprint of how a South African future looks like. We just need better implementation and a better sense of commitment to servicing the people who vote for these leaders. And ultimately, I think that would address many of the problems that we have. And then, of course, we've seen corruption in this country has risen to shocking levels over the past 9 years or so that President Jacob Zuma has been at the helm. So I guess at some level it's also to reverse this growth of corruption and return to just good basic governance principles, and I guess renew the social contract that was established immediately after the end of apartheid, that it is about incorporating people who are excluded from participating in the economy, excluded from being part of mainstream society. So that is the challenge for whomever emerges, whether it be Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma or Cyril Ramaphosa, and indeed they can't do it on their own. To go back to your point earlier on, they need a party that goes with that vision, and I think the ANC realizes that if they don't change course, 2019 may be a case where they may lose great support more than they did in the 2016
We'll see what's going to happen.
Elections.
2 key words, though, coming from you. One is implementation, the other is commitment. Do you agree with that, Mr. Sikati?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that those are ideals that you'd like to see embodied by, any government that's in place. But I mean, at the root of this, I think what is at the root of what people are looking for is the idea of transformation. We can't really underestimate the significance of the role that this has played and is still playing in terms of the public discourse now. So I mean, I wish actually, there's been so much tension, hoping that the result would come out.
So in a way, you're saying we need a new blueprint. Is that what you're saying in South Africa?
I mean,
don't just say the same thing once and again.
Yeah, no. Look, there's an appetite for change. People need change. There's definitely an appetite for change, and the ruling party has realized that. Number one, internally they've realized that in the way that they've changed the way in which they've managed the succession process, and number two, the candidates who, one of whom will take over, have realized that in terms of, the messages that they're putting out there. So inevitably, something's going to have to give. Yeah.
Something's going to have to give. What is that exactly the thing you are talking about? Let's go to you, Mr. Zhu, once again as an observer.
I think the ANC is facing the huge challenges, and the ANC leaderships and the members, they realize the importance of change. But the problem is that the ANC has a long history, and internally it has different blocks. For example, this time it's clear that ANC is almost divided into 2 blocks. So the future direction of reform and the outcome would depend on how the different groups could reach a certain kind of consensus and make some joint efforts towards a better governance of itself. Then the ANC could play a good leading role in improving the whole good governance of South Africa.
I see. Well, as the election result is still having some time to come out. We have to wrap up today's discussion. I want to thank the three of you for sharing with us your insights from inside out. Yu Min, Lu Yogo Sigaje, and also Mr. Zokolo Bolase. I hope I pronounced all your name right. I'm learning, and we are learning about South African politics as well. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, China's top economic planners gather in a conference thinking about ways to sustain mid to high economic growth. We'll also delve into high-quality development and what it means for the future of the economy right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. This morning, Monday morning, China's top annual economic meeting has opened. The leaders are gathering to chart the course of next year's economic development. This year, high-quality development is at the top of the agenda, but how can the goal be achieved while carrying out reforms? Meanwhile, we also understand on Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump will roll out his national security strategy, in which China's name is likely to be mentioned. So how will that affect China-U.S. economic relations? Before we go to our panel, take a look at this first.
From rapid growth to high-quality development. More is expected at this three-day economic conference. Plans for economic growth, supply-side structural reforms, and high-quality development will be mapped out. Also high on the agenda are efforts to promote foreign direct investment, financial risk controls, tax and fee reforms, and improvement to the rental housing system. In the party's October Congress, CPC General Secretary Xi Jinping said that China's economy has been in transition. It is at a time of economic restructuring and mid to high speed growth. World financial institutions are positive about China's economic growth. The IMF has raised its forecast for China's growth in 2017 to 6.8%, saying the country has been making progress in moving to a more service-dominated economy. However, the IMF said businesses were over-reliant on debt.
The part that we're most concerned about is corporate debt. Corporate debt, depending on how you define it, is between 135 or 155% of GDP. That's high in an international standard, and again, it continues to rise.
There are not only domestic challenges, but concerns abroad as well. On Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump's administration rolls out its national security strategy, and some say that he will likely define China as a competitor.
We are willing to work hard with the U.S. side to dedicate ourselves to building a robust, stable, and healthy trade and economic relationship.
Trump repeatedly slammed China over trade, but he softened his stance after meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping at his Mar-a-Lago resort. And earlier in November, when they met in Beijing, deals worth $250 billion were signed, and Mr. Trump has declined to label China a currency manipulator. Far from a reprieve, things may once again become uncertain.
For more on China's ongoing Central Economic Work Conference and the very future of the U.S.-China trade and economic ties, we are joining in our Beijing studio Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics here in Beijing. In Hong Kong, we have Edward Xie, the CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. Welcome. In Washington, D.C., we have Dan Slane from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Welcome as well. I want to start with you, Professor Liu.
Yes.
China has been lining up its goals for economic growth. One is about trying to look at curbing the debts, the risks. Secondly, alleviating poverty. Thirdly, curbing pollution. Can these three goals be easily achieved for next year?
Well, this is really a grand mission, and overall it is really a quality growth for China. there is immense amount of task lying ahead, but we have already built the confidence. Look at the air in Beijing in this winter, so it has really improved quite a great deal.
Did you stay most of the time so far here in Beijing?
That's right.
Good for you. All right, so let's go to Mr. Xie now about some of the questions related to this. Mr. Xie, we are talking about quite complicated things, so let's take a look at the potential. What's going to happen next year? Reform and opening up policy. That's going to be 40th anniversary next year. Big day. Secondly, China trying to transform its economy. Thirdly, very likely, according to the draft that the media has got hold of, the Trump administration going to name China as the strategic competitor together with Russia. So we are seeing very complicated domestic and also international environment, shall we say. What would that mean for China's economy and for those who are attending the ongoing Central Economic Conference?
Yeah, you're right. Next year is probably going to be a pretty complicated year for China, and also, as you know, the relationship with the U.S. and perhaps other countries in the West. At the same time, we believe that the economic growth in China will probably continue to go on at a reasonably high rate. In other words, around 6.5% and so on, mostly because the innovation and the entrepreneurship in China will probably continue to generate some economic growth, as well as the rise of the middle class, and also the trading up that the middle class consumers in China is probably going to be doing. So, yeah, next year we believe that it's going to be economically reasonable for China. At the same time, as you correctly said, its relationship with the U.S. is probably something that the senior leaders in China will probably need to pay attention to.
I see. Professor Liu, it's not just the relationship with the United States that's likely to be more complicated than it used to be, but also what is going on inside China. Where does the momentum come from in order to push for a further round of reform and opening up? And who is going to be responsible for that? Who is going to be brave enough to push forward some of the areas which has been there for quite some time, waiting for the chance to be changed? Professor Liu.
Well, the whole China is still looking more to the government as the leader and also engineer, but also driver behind this quality growth. And the other is that China is also working together with many of those strategic partners around the world. For example, the Belt and Road program is also there to give further fuel for China's growing dynamism. And also the business leaders are paying a great attention to move more in line with the government direction in terms of innovation, in terms of the business leadership, to contribute more to the society instead of merely for profit seeking.
I see. Mr. Slane, coming from the U.S., you have been attentively listening to your two Chinese colleagues. Let me go to you for now. When the national security strategy is coming out on Monday, what advice, if you were being asked by your Chinese colleague, for China to act or react to when it comes to its future trade and economic policy toward the United States, what would you say?
Well, I think you're going to see more enforcement of the trade laws. I think Trump is trying to clamp down on what he sees abuses and correctly blames the United States for not enforcing the trade laws. So I think you're going to see some tension there, and that's I think that's something that'll eventually work its way out. And historically, there's always been a lot of compromise on that before anybody goes off the cliff.
But
and I think listening to your other two go ahead,
sir.
Listening to your other two guests, I think the future where China is going is into high tech. When you look at their 2025 plan, And here's a plan that they have funded with $1 trillion, artificial intelligence, robotics, biotechnology, optoelectronics, et cetera, et cetera. That's where he's trying to take this economy, and that's the future. And so he's, you know, that's what's happening in China today.
All right, but Mr. Slane, may I follow up? Even on these areas, I mean just new tech, high tech, new economy, there is a possibility and necessity for countries such as China and the United States to cooperate. If the air is getting really bad, I mean the atmosphere between the two countries, about these exchanges by high technology and cooperating about these applications, what would that mean for the two countries, including China's economy and that of the U.S.?
Well, I think that it's very difficult sometimes to cooperate if there's a lot of mistrust, which exists today between the two countries. And I think that you know, maybe trying to focus on some areas that are not controversial, such as the environment, where the United States has a lot to offer in terms of technology to clean it up. We've been all through that with Pittsburgh and other cities in the United States.
Right.
So I think you know, one area is to try to find some place where we can start to cooperate together and then hopefully expand that out.
That's true. You can see Mr. Slane is really making an effort trying to find an area that the two sides can work together. But the climate change agreement, of course, the United States didn't sign on as the national government. Well, China is part of it. So, well, there are a lot of complicated issues. Mr. Xie, let me go to you. Even about some of the specific issues, growth rate of China, GDP, what is likely to be? Is it still important when it comes to the quality and vis-a-vis the speed? Secondly, how are some of the grand goals, as we mentioned at the very beginning, is likely to be implemented? Who's going to be responsible for those goals? It usually takes a lot of interactions among various organizations of the administration. Mr. Xie.
Yeah, as you know, during the first couple of decades of China's economic reform, the focus was almost entirely on GDP growth. As we know, it has, on one hand, sort of led to very high economic growth. On the other hand, it also created a lot of problems, including the environmental issues that you already mentioned. So right now, I think the Chinese government, as well as the Chinese people in general, do recognize that a pure or a blind pursuit of just GDP growth is probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
We need to have a more balanced growth. GDP is important, but it's not the only thing in the world. We need to have a more balanced life, so environmental improvement, poverty alleviation, and so on and so forth are going to be very important in the next phase of our growth.
Since we have already identified some of these important areas, let's just focus on them with some very brief answers for solutions coming from all of you. One is about the debt issue. That's going to create risks, and IMF earlier had been warning China about that, even though later there has been a lot of debate about it. So, Professor Liu, the debt issue and the issue of the so-called state vis-a-vis the non-state sector.
Well, this is probably the most challenging one, because the liquidity has been far large, particularly the mounting debt on the corporate side and even on consumer side. So that's something that really we need to bring the alarm bell. And now I think the government is still in a very difficult dilemma, because on one side, if you raise the interest rate and tighten the liquidity, how to deliver the GDP growth, because the government has solemnly pledged to the whole world and to the Chinese people by 2020, we have only 3 years left to double Chinese GDP based on 2010. And the other is that if we really allow a large liquidity, so the economic bubble is still there, that's presenting an even further danger. So to reform the SOE, who is still money losing, and also to tighten regulation over the P2P and shadow banking. So those are immense amount of tasks, particularly in view of the entrenched vested interest groups that are already being formed.
All right, that's one issue. The other issue is about fighting against the poverty to eliminate it. And Mr. Xie, you know that very well, it's not just an economic issue. It's a social issue too. You have a lot of left alone kids in those rural areas. You have extreme lack of education opportunities in those impoverished areas. It's not just about the income. It's a social issue. Can that be done within a year as the economic conference is now going on? Mr. Xie, briefly.
As you know, this is a long-term issue. As you correctly said, it's a social and structural issue. So it's almost impossible that in 1 year, China can fully alleviate the poverty issue. However, it's appropriate and correct to put that as a core issue to be addressed in the work conference coming up. I believe that it requires the efforts of a lot of stakeholders in the process, both the central government, the local government, and perhaps also the responsible corporation as well. Corporates can also take a big part in funding the poverty alleviation, and I hope we can see more corporations taking part in this.
Mr. Slane, I want to go to you about that, the pollution issue, because earlier you are very passionate about that, even from the U.S. perspective. The pollution issue is not on its own. It's related to the structural reform of the industries and economy of China. It is related to the employment opportunities in different parts of China. It is also related to the health issue, to the educational issue. So it is not alone as an economic issue either. Mr. Slane, with this very complicated things related to it, what is the way you think that will be really working here in China, given your knowledge of this country?
I think the solution is technology and getting away from fossil fuels and switching over to alternative fuels, wind power, gas. And the future in China and the United States is with electric automobiles, so that and that's a big part of the problem. So as China starts to build their electric cars and starts to switch over to alternative energy sources, they're going to get away from the fossil fuels. There's a large, you can't expect change very quickly here. This is a massive undertaking, and and they depend on the power to run their factories, and so you're going to have a certain amount of pollution until they're able to make this shift. And it's going to take a number of years, but they're moving in the right direction. In the United States, the whole future is based on electric cars. So I mean, you can imagine if all those vehicles 5 or 10 years from now that are in China were electrically operated and not using fossil fuels, that's going to have an enormous impact on the environment.
We hope that will be the case, even though, Mr. Slane, you probably also know that many of the electricities used in China are actually from a coal power plant. So there's another issue of so-called the clean energy, how that would come into being. Electricity is not the way to solve the problem, but how to make sure it is not coming from the dirty coal. That is the ultimate thing, and probably the subsidies that creates another so-called discussion of competition between China and the United States. You know that is even more complicated than we just analyzed. But having said that, though, let me go to the final question. I do want to invite the wisdom from the three of you gentlemen. When the national security strategy is coming out in Washington on Monday by the Trump administration, that's likely to be the paper that the Home Administration would cling to for future policy structures. Okay, if China eventually was being termed as a strategic competitor, how should people like you, who have been working very hard for the economy and economic exchanges between the two countries, be able to come to terms and solutions of this apparent distrust crisis? Professor Liu, let me go to you first.
Well, I think, ideologically, China should really feel proud to be named as a competitor by the biggest guy on the block. you're noticeable and you're named as a competitor. On the other hand, we should be fully prepared that there's going to be increased tension, and during the past 11 months of the Trump administration, we already see that a number of shots have been fired against China, despite the goodwill shown by China, delivering the 100-day action plan and also giving big orders to the United States during Trump's visit into China. So I think equally we should also get prepared with a strategy as how to engage and how to deal with this, only by talking about...
The question is how. Mr. Slane, do you also have silver lining as Professor Liu just did? Very briefly from you, are running out of time.
No, I see more tension, and it's not only with China, it's with Korea, Mexico, Canada. So I see a lot of tension on the trade side, but ultimately it will get compromised out in the long run.
We hope the ultimate time will come very soon. Mr. Xie, what about you? Your thought?
Well, it's okay for the U.S. to label China as a strategic competitor, because indeed China has been advancing very rapidly in many dimensions. However, I believe the solution is probably going to be a lot in the business-to-business area. This is not going to be just a zero-sum game. Chinese business and American business can collaborate along many dimensions, and I think the real solution is going to lie there and not government to government.
We hope it will be eventually robust, healthy, and stable, as the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson have been talking about, but probably that takes a while. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for joining us on the discussion of the ongoing Central Economic Work Conference. Liu Baocheng, Edward Xie, Dan Slane, thank you so much. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight with Tian Wei team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.